Hello friends, welcome to the reading room. Today you're going to listen Class 9th Chapter 1 The French Revolution. On the morning of 14 July 1789, the city of Paris was in a state of alarm. The king had commanded troops to move into the city. Rumors spread that he would soon order the army to open fire upon the citizens. Some 7,000 men and women gathered in front of the town hall and decided to form People's Militia. They broke into a number of government buildings in search of arms. Finally, a group of several hundred people marched towards the eastern part of the city and stormed the fortress prison, the Bastille, where they hoped to find hoarded ammunition. In the armed fight that followed, the commander of the Bastille was killed and the prisoners released, though there were only 7 of them. Yet the Bastille was hated by all because it stood for the despotic power of the king. The fortress was demolished and its stone fragments were sold in the market to all those who wished to keep a souvenir of its destruction. The days that followed saw more rioting both in Paris and the countryside. Most people were protesting against high price of bread. Much later, when historians look back upon this time, they saw it as the beginning of chain of events that ultimately led to the execution of the king in France, though most people at the time did not anticipate this outcome. How and why did this happen? French society during the late 18th century. In 1774, Louis XVI of the Bourbon family ascended the throne of France. He was 20 years old and married to the Austrian princess Marie Antoinette. Upon his accession, the new king found an empty treasury. Long years of war had drained the financial resources of France. Added to this was the cost of maintaining an extravagant court at the immense palace of Versailles. Under Louis XVI, France helped 13 American colonies to gain their independence from the common enemy Britain. The war added more than a billion livres to a debt that had already risen to more than 2 billion livres. Lenders who gave the state credit now began to charge 10% interest on loans. So the French government was obliged to spend an increasing percentage of its budget on interest payments alone. To meet its regular expenses, such as the cost of maintaining an army, the court, running government offices or universities, the state was forced to increase taxes. Yet even this measure would not have sufficed. French society in the 18th century was divided into 3 estates, and only members of third estate paid taxes. The third estate was away from the privileges. The estates are as followed. First estate, clergy. Second estate, nobility. Third estate, big businessmen, merchants, court officials, lawyers, etc., peasants and artisans, small peasants, landless labor, and servants. The society of estate was part of the feudal system that dated back to the Middle Ages. The term old regime is usually used to describe the society and institution of France before 1789. Peasants made up about 90% of the population. However, only a small number of them owned the land they cultivated. About 60% of the land was owned by nobles, the church, and other richer members of the third estate. The members of the first two estates, that is, clergy and nobility, enjoyed certain privileges by birth. The most important of these was exemption from paying taxes to the state. The nobles further enjoyed feudal privileges. These included feudal dues, which they extracted from peasants. Peasants were obliged to render services to the lord, to work in his house and field, to serve in the army, or to participate in building roads. The church too extracted its share of taxes called tithes from the peasants, and finally all members of the third estate had to pay taxes to the state. These included a direct tax called tally and a number of indirect taxes which were levied on articles of everyday consumption like salt or tobacco. The burden of financing activities of the state through taxes was borne by the third estate alone. The struggle to survive. The population of France rose from about 23 billion in 1715 to 28 million in 1789. This led to a rapid increase in the demand for food grains. Production of grains could not keep pace with the demand, so the price of bread, which was the staple diet of majority, rose rapidly. Most workers were employed as laborers in workshops whose owner fixed their wages, but wages did not keep pace with the rise in prices, so the gap between the poor and rich widened. Things became worse whenever drought or hail reduced the harvest. This led to subsistence crisis, something that occurred frequently in France during Old Regime. New words. Livre, unit of currency in France, discontinued in 1794. Clergy, group of persons invested with special functions in the church. Tithe, a tax levied by the church comprising 1/10 of the agricultural produce. Tally, tax to be provided directly to the state. A growing middle class envisages an end to privileges. In the past, peasants and workers had participated in revolts against increasing taxes and food scarcity, but they lacked the means and programs to carry out full-scale measures that would bring about a change in the social and economic order. This was left to those groups within the Third Estate who had become prosperous and had access to education and new ideas. The 18th century witnessed the emergence of social groups termed the middle class, who earned their wealth through an expanding overseas trade and from the manufacture of goods such as woolen and silk textile that were either exported or bought by the richer members of society. In addition to merchants and manufacturers, the Third Estate included professions such as lawyers or administrative officials. All of these were educated and believed that no group in the society should be privileged by birth. Rather, a person's social position must depend on his merit. These ideas, envisaging a society based on freedom and equal laws and opportunities for all, were put forward by philosophers such as John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his two treatises of government. John Locke sought to refute the doctrine of divine and absolute right of the monarch. Rousseau carried the idea forward, proposing a form of government based on a social contract between people and their representatives. In the spirit of laws, Montesquieu proposed a division of power within the government between the legislative, executive, and judiciary. This model of the government was put into force in the USA after the 13 colonies declared their independence from Britain. The American Constitution and its guarantee of individual rights was an important example for political thinkers in France. The ideas of these philosophers were discussed intensively in salons and coffee houses and spread among people through books and newspapers. These were frequently read aloud in groups for the benefit of those who could not read and write. The news that Louis XVI planned to impose further taxes to be able to meet the expenses of the state generated anger and protest against the system of privileges. The outbreak of the revolution. Louis XVI had to increase taxes for reasons you have learned in the previous section. How do you think he could have gone about doing this? In France of old regime, the monarch did not have the power to impose taxes according to his will alone. Rather, he had to call a meeting of the Estates General, which would then pass his proposal for new taxes. The Estates General was a political body to which the three estates sent their representatives. However, the monarch alone could decide when to call a meeting of his body. The last time it was done was in 1614. On May 1789, on the date Fayu, Louis XVI called together an assembly of the Estates General to pass proposals for new taxes. A resplendent hall in Versailles was prepared to host the delegates. The first and second estates sent 300 representatives each, who were seated in rows facing each other on two sides, while the 600 members of the third estate had to stand at the back. The third estate was represented by its more prosperous and educated members. Peasants, artisans, and women were denied entry to the assembly. However, their grievances and demands were listed in some 40,000 letters which the representatives had brought with them. Voting in the Estates General in the past had been conducted according to the principle that each estate had one vote. This time too, Louis XVI was determined to continue the same practice, but members of the Third Estate demanded that voting now be conducted by an assembly as a whole, where each member would have one vote. This was one of the democratic principles put forward by philosophers such as Rousseau in his book The Social Contract. When the king rejected this proposal, members of the Third Estate walked out of the assembly in protest. The representatives of Third Estate viewed themselves as spokespersons for the whole French nation. On 20 June, they assembled in the hall of an indoor tennis court in the ground of Versailles. They declared themselves as National Assembly and swore not to disperse till they had drafted a constitution for France that would limit the power of the monarch. They were led by Mirabeau and Abbessius. Mirabeau was born in a noble family but was convinced of the need to do away with the society of feudal privileges. He brought out a journal and delivered powerful speeches to the crowds assembled at Versailles. Abbessius, originally a priest, wrote an influential pamphlet, What is the Third Estate? While the National Assembly was busy at Versailles drafting a constitution, the rest of France seethed with turmoil. A severe winter had meant a bad harvest. The price of bread rose. Often bakers exploited the situation and hoarded supplies. After spending hours in long queues at the bakery, crowds of angry women stormed into the shops. At the same time, the king ordered troops to move into Paris. On 14 July, the agitated crowd stormed and destroyed the Bastille. In the countryside, rumors spread that from village to village that the lords of the manor had hired bands of brigands who were on their way to destroy the ripe crops. Caught in a frenzy of fear, peasants in several districts seized hoes and pitchforks and attacked Chatillon, which is the castle, and manor, an estate consisting of lord's land and his mansion. They looted hoarded grain and banned to listen anything, and burned down documents containing records of manorial dues. A large number of nobles fled from their homes, many of them migrating to neighboring countries. Faced with the power of his revolting subjects, Louis XVI finally accorded recognition to the National Assembly and accepted the principle that his power would from now on be checked by a constitution. On the night of 4 August 1789, the Assembly passed a decree abolishing the feudal system of obligations and taxes. Members of the clergy too were forced to give up their privileges. Tithes were abolished and land owned by the church were confiscated. As a result, the government acquired assets worth at least 2 billion livres. France becomes a constitutional monarchy. The National Assembly completed the draft of the Constitution in 1791. Its main object was to limit the powers of the monarch. These powers, instead of being concentrated in the hands of one person, were now separated and assigned to different institutions: the legislature, executive, and judiciary. This made France a constitutional monarchy. Let us see how the new political system worked. Passive citizens had no voting rights. About 3 million men were passive citizens, women, children, and youth below 25. Active citizens entitled to vote, about 4 million of a population of 28 million, voted to electors, which were 50,000 men, and then electors vote to form National Assembly of 745 members. National Assembly and electors came under legislature. Then National Assembly had control over king and ministers. King and minister came under executive. And these active citizens also vote for a judge, which came under judiciary. The Constitution of 1791 vested the power to make laws in the National Assembly, which was indirectly elected. That is, citizens voted for a group of electors who in turn chose the assembly. Not all citizens, however, had the right to vote. Only men about 25 years of age who paid taxes equal to at least 3 days of laborer's wage were given the status of active citizens, that is, they were entitled to vote. The remaining men and all women were classified as passive citizens. To qualify as an elector and then as a member of the assembly, a man had to belong to the highest bracket of taxpayers. The Constitution began with a declaration of the rights of man and citizen. Rights such as the right to life, freedom of speech, freedom of opinion, equality before law were established as natural and inalienable rights, that is, they belong to each human being by birth and could not be taken away. It was the duty of the state to protect each citizen's natural rights. Now let us see some political symbols. First, the broken chain. Chains were used to fetter slaves. A broken chain stands for the act of becoming free. Second, the bundle of rods or faces. One rod can be easily broken, but not an entire bundle. Strength lies in unity. Third, the eye within a triangle radiating light. The all-seeing eye stands for knowledge. The rays of the sun will drive away the clouds of ignorance. Fourth, sceptre, symbol of royal power. Fifth, snake biting its tail to form a ring, symbol of eternity. A ring has neither beginning nor end. Sixth, red Phrygian cap, cap worn by a slave upon becoming free. Seventh, blue, white, red, the national colors of France. Eighth, the winged woman, symbol of the law, personification of the law. Ninth, the law tablet. The law is the same for all and all are equal before it. France abolishes monarchy and becomes a republic. The situation in France continued to be tense during the following years. Although Louis XVI had signed the constitution, he entered into secret negotiation with the King of Prussia. Rulers of other neighboring countries too were worried by the development in France and made plans to send troops to put down the events that had been taking place there since the summer of 1789. Before this could happen, the National Assembly voted in April 1792 to declare war against Prussia and Austria. Thousands of volunteers thronged from the provinces to join the army. They saw this as a war of people against king and aristocracies all over Europe. Among the patriotic songs they sang was the Marseillaise, composed by the poet Roger de Lisle It was sung for the first time by volunteers from Marseilles as they marched into Paris and so got its name. The Marseillaise is now the national anthem of France. The Revolutionary Wars brought losses and economic difficulties to the people. While the men were away fighting at the front, women were left to cope with the task of earning a livelihood and looking after their families. Large sections of the population were convinced that the revolution had to be carried further as the Constitution of 1791 gave political rights only to the richer section of the society. Political clubs became an important rallying point for people who wished to discuss government policies and plan their own forms of action. The most successful of these clubs was that of the Jacobins, which got its name from the former convent of Saint Jacob in Paris. Women too, who had been active throughout this period, formed their own clubs. Section 4 of this chapter will tell you more about their activities and demands. The members of the Jacobin Club belonged mainly to the less prosperous section of society. They included small shopkeepers, artisans such as shoemakers, pastry cooks, watchmakers, printers, as well as servants and daily wage workers. Their leader was Maximilien Robespierre. A large group among the Jacobins decided to start wearing long striped trousers similar to those worn by dock workers. This was set themselves to apart from the fashionable section of society, especially nobles who wore knee breeches. It was a way of proclaiming the end of the power wielded by wearers of knee breeches. These Jacobins came to be known as the sans-culottes, literally meaning those without knee breeches. Sans-culottes means wore in addition the red cap that symbolized liberty. Women, however, were not allowed to do so. In the summer of 1792, the Jacobins planned an insurrection of a large number of Parisians who were angered by the short supplies and high prices of food. On the morning of August 10, they stormed the palace of the Tuileries, massacred the king's guards, and held the king himself as hostage for several hours. Later, the assembly voted to imprison the royal family. Elections were held from now on. All men of 21 years and above, regardless of wealth, got the right to vote. The newly elected assembly was called the Convention. On 21 September 1792, it abolished monarchy and declared France as republic. As you know, a republic is a form of government where people elect the government, including the head of the government. There is no hereditary monarchy. You can try and find out about some other countries that are republic and investigate when and how they became so. Louis XVI was sentenced to death by a court on the charge of treason. On 21 January 1793, he was executed publicly at the Place de la Concorde. The Queen Marie Antoinette met with the same after shortly time. The Reign of Terror. The period from 1793 to 1794 is referred to as the Reign of Terror. Robespierre followed a policy of severe control and punishment. All those whom he saw as being enemies of the Republic, ex-nobles and clergy, members of other political parties, even members of his own party who did not agree with his method, were arrested, imprisoned, and then tried by a revolutionary tribunal. If the court found them guilty, they were guillotined. The guillotine is a device consisting of two poles and a blade with which a person is beheaded. It was named after Dr. Guillotine, who invented it. Robespierre's government issued laws placing a maximum ceiling on wages and prices. Meat and bread were rationed. Peasants were forced to transport their grain to the cities and sell it at price fixed by the government. The use of more expensive white flour and forbidden. All citizens were required to eat the pain d'egalite, equality bread, a loaf made of whole wheat. Equality was also sought to be practiced through forms of speech and address. Instead of traditional monsieur, sir, and madame, all French men and women were henceforth citoyen and citoyenne, means citizen. Churches were shut down and their buildings converted into barracks or offices. Robespierre pursued his policies so relentlessly that even his supporters began to demand moderation. Finally, he was convicted by a court in July 1794, arrested, and on the next day sent to the guillotine. A dictatorship rules France. The fall of the Jacobin government allowed the wealthier middle classes to seize power. A new constitution was introduced which denied the vote to non-property section of society. It provided for two elected legislative council. These then appointed a directory and executive made up of 5 members. This was meant as a safeguard against the concentration of power in a one-man executive as under the Jacobins. However, the directors often clashed with the legislative council who then sought to dismiss them. The political instability of the directory paved the way for the rise of military dictator Napoleon Bonaparte. Though through all these changes in the form of government, the ideals of freedom, of equality before the law, and of fraternity remained inspiring ideals that motivated political movement in France and the rest of Europe during the following century. Did women have a revolution? From the very beginning, women were active participants in the events which brought about so many important changes in French society. They hoped that their involvement would pressurize the revolutionary government to introduce measures to improve their lives. Most women of the Third Estate had to work for a living. They worked as seamstresses or laundresses, sold flowers, fruits, and vegetables at the market, or were employed as domestic servants in the houses of the prosperous people. Most women did not have access to education or job training. Only daughters of nobles or wealthier members of the Third Estate could study at a convent, after which their families arranged a marriage for them. Working women had also to care for their families, that is, cook, fetch water, queue up for bread, and look after the children. Their wages were lower than those of men. In order to discuss and voice their interest, women started their own political clubs and newspapers. About 60 women's clubs came up in different French cities. The Society of Revolutionary and Republican Women was the most famous of them. One of their main demands was that women enjoy the same political right as men. Women were disappointed that the Constitution of 1791 reduced them to passive citizens. They demanded the right to vote, to be elected to the assembly, and to hold political offices. Only then, they felt, would their interests be represented in the new government. In the early years, the revolutionary government did not introduce laws had helped improve the life of women. Together with the creation of state schools, schooling was made compulsory for all girls. Their father could no longer force them into marriage against their will. Marriage was made into a contract entered into freely and registered under civil law. Divorce was made legal and could be applied for by both women and men. Women could now train for jobs, could become artists or run small businesses. Women's struggle for equal political rights, however, continued. During the Reign of Terror, the new government issued law ordering closure of women's clubs and banning their political activities. Many prominent women were arrested and a number of them executed. Women's movement for voting rights and equal wages continued through the next 200 years in many countries of the world. The fight for the vote was carried out through an international suffrage movement during the late 19th and early 20th century. The example of political activities of French women during the revolutionary years was kept alive as an inspiring memory. It was finally in 1946 that women in France won the right to vote. The abolition of slavery. One of the most revolutionary social reforms of the Jacobin regime was the abolition of slavery in the French colonies. The colonies in the Caribbean, Martinique, Guadeloupe, and San Domingo were important suppliers of commodities such as tobacco, indigo, sugar, and coffee. But the reluctance of Europeans to go and work in distant and unfamiliar land meant a shortage of labor on the plantation. So, this was met by a triangular slave trade between Europe, Africa, and the America. The slave trade began in the 17th century. French merchants sailed from the ports of Bordeaux or Nantes to the African coast where they brought slaves from local chieftains. Branded and shackled, the slaves were packed tightly into ships for the 3-month-long voyage across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. There they were sold to plantation owners. The exploitation of slave labor made it possible to meet the growing demand in European market for sugar, coffee, and indigo. Port cities like Bordeaux and Nantes owed their economic prosperity to the flourishing slave trade. Throughout the 18th century, there was little criticism of slavery in France. The National Assembly held long debates about whether the rights of man should be extended to all French subjects, including those in the colonies, but it did not pass any laws, fearing opposition from businessmen whose income depended on the slave trade. It was finally the convention which in 1794 legislated to free all slaves in the French overseas possession. This, however, turned out to be the short-term measure. 10 years later, Napoleon introduced slavery again. Plantation owners understood their freedom as including the right to enslave African Negroes in pursuit of their economic interest. Slavery was finally abolished in French colonies in 1848. The revolution and everyday life. Can politics change the clothes people wear, the language they speak, or the books they read? The years following 1789 in France saw many such changes in the life of men, women, and children. The revolutionary government took it upon themselves to pass laws that would translate the ideals of liberty and equality to everyday practice. One important law that came into effect soon after the storming of the Bastille in the summer of 1789 was the abolition of censorship. In the old regime, all written material and cultural activities, books, newspaper, play could be published or performed only after they had been approved by the censors of the king. Now the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen proclaimed freedom of speech and expression to be natural right. Newspapers, pamphlets, books, and printed pictures flooded to the towns of France from where they traveled rapidly into the countryside. They all described and discussed the events and changes taking place in France. Freedom of the press also meant that opposing views of events could be expressed. Each side sought to convince the others of its position through the medium of print. Plays, songs, and festive procession attracted large number of people. This was one way they could grasp and identify with ideas such as liberty or justice that political philosophers wrote about at length in texts which only a handful of educated people could read. Conclusion. In 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself Emperor of France. He set out to conquer neighboring European countries, disposing dynasties and creating kingdoms where he placed members of his family. Napoleon saw his role as a modernizer of Europe. He introduced many such as laws that the protection of private property and a uniform system of weight and measures provided by the decimal system. Initially, many saw Napoleon as a liberator who would bring freedom for the people, but soon Napoleonic armies came to be viewed everywhere as an invading force. He was finally defeated at Waterloo in 1815. Many of his measures that carried the revolutionary ideas of liberty and modern laws to other parts of Europe had an impact on people long after Napoleon had left. The ideas of liberty and democratic rights were the most important legacy of the French Revolution. These spread from France to the rest of Europe during the 19th century, where feudal systems were abolished. Colonized people reworked the idea of freedom from bondage into their movements to create a sovereign nation state. Tipu Sultan and Ram Mohan Roy are two examples of individuals who respond to the ideas coming from revolutionary France. That's it for today. Let's meet in the next video. Thank you.